Welcome to week 6 and chapter 6, where we're going to talk about police organizations, how they're structured, what their role and function is. We're going to focus on how police departments are organized. And when I say police departments, I'm really talking about just about every kind of law enforcement agency there is. There's always differences between sheriff's offices and police departments and even state police agencies, but for the most part, the structure is loosely very the same. We're going to talk about their functions, the differences between patrol and investigations. We're going to talk about ways to improve patrol and some problem areas within investigations. And then we're going to talk about some specialized roles that the police have undertaken or projects that have um, larger agencies have taken on, such as community policing, problem oriented policing, intelligence led policing, evidence based policing, which is the newest one to have recently come out. And we're going to talk about support functions within police agencies and how efficiencies or cost savings may or may not be realized. When we're talking about the organization of police departments, we're talking about the rank structure. Remember, last week I had talked about the fact that most agencies have become paramilitary in nature, and that started after the evolution of agencies into a more professional endeavor. And it really came down to the ability to control the individual actions of officers in a manner that fits policy and fits strategy on a regular basis. And that requires control and supervision, which requires a rank structure, much like the military has. In most cases, when we're talking about line officers, we're talking about a police officer or a deputy sheriff or a state trooper. They're the boots on the ground folks that respond to calls for service, that patrol in order to deter crime. They control traffic. Um, they work accident scenes, things of that nature. They don't necessarily get involved into, at least in larger departments, don't necessarily get involved in in-depth investigations except to support. Detectives have the primary responsibility for criminal investigation. They are not first responders, though they're trained as such. You can't typically become a detective without first having served as a police officer. They don't immediately respond to most calls, but they're there shortly after. And their job is to preserve and investigate a crime scene, to canvass neighborhoods, etc., in order to see a criminal investigation completed until prosecution. When we get into the leadership roles, we see a span of control begin to expand. So, a sergeant is a frontline supervisor who typically controls or has supervision responsibility of anywhere from 4 to 10 officers, depending on the agency and their size. A lieutenant typically will directly supervise 2 to 3 sergeants who, again, have 4 to 10 officers underneath them. And their role is typically more of on scene command of larger incidents and making sure um, that their units are functioning the way that they're supposed to. They're typically considered a unit commander. A captain in most size agencies is a division commander, such as the patrol division, the investigative division, the communications division, etc. Those are usually managed and oversight happens there by a captain. A deputy inspector is the title that our textbook is using, and that's typically an East Coast title. In most Midwestern states, you're going to see an assistant chief, an undersheriff, or a chief deputy, something of that nature, and they're typically an assistant or a number two in charge. In very large agencies, there are multiple assistants, just depending upon how big that agency actually is. And then, of course, you have the chief of police or the sheriff or a director who has overall responsibility for the entire agency. So, what are the more specific, distinctive differences between patrol functions and investigative functions? Well, patrol officers, their principal role is crime deterrence through their presence, meaning they're the visible aspect of an agency. They're the ones that are out in marked cars or on bikes or sometimes even on foot in a full uniform that's distinctive, that the public recognizes them for who they are, working through what they need to. They have a peacekeeping responsibility. They respond to calls for fights, for domestic violence, for um, any kind, a bar fight, anything of that nature that's disruptive to um, the common peace. They have an emergency response responsibility. So any kind of an emergency going on, the police have responsibility to get there and help control that scene or resolve the emergency. Their job is to arrest violators. So they're the ones that are making the snap judgments on some calls, whether someone should be incarcerated or not. And then, of course, as I mentioned before, to control traffic within their jurisdiction. Investigators have a more specialized focus. They're looking at felony level investigations, sometimes misdemeanors, depending upon the agency, but in most cases, it's a felony level investigation. And detective branches in larger agencies can branch out into different specifics, such as narcotics or vice or an auto vehicle theft unit. It just depends on what the agencies decide to structure, but it allows for more specialization than a patrol function does. Practically, they conduct interviews, they canvass neighborhoods for information, and they investigate crime scenes once they've been called to begin that process. They also evaluate informative data. So they are considering more detailed information than typical crime statistics, but other relative information to law enforcement to help make informed decisions related to a case. These are the guys that do cell phone search warrants or computer search warrants to look at metadata and user inputted data to help build cases. Going back to patrol. So, what efforts have been made to make the function that patrol officers perform more efficient or better? There's been several different theories that have been put to the test. An aggressive patrol stance typically involves mirroring something like the Kansas City study. And what the Kansas City study determined was, or attempted to determine, was that if you took more officers and put them in your specific troubled areas within your community, in other words, if you got a specific neighborhood that is gang ridden or has a high case of violent crime, the more officers you put into that area, the more likely you are to reduce crime because you've got officers closer to deter it, detect it, and to stop it. The measurements of the Kansas City study showed really there was no change in the amount of time that they spent in troubled neighborhoods and reducing crime. Crime simply moved to an area where law enforcement was not. The broken windows theory is one that was probably made the most famous by Rudy Giuliani in New York. And the argument behind the broken windows theory is that neighborhoods send unspoken signals about the availability to commit crime based upon its appearance. So if a neighborhood is run down, unkept, and overrun, the argument is that it signals opportunity for increased criminal activity. This is one that, in my tenure as sheriff, that I have subscribed at least partially to, because we've seen time and again where those who seek to traffic narcotics into a community that they're not familiar with will come in, will look at a rundown, almost condemned piece of property and invest in it because they can invest in it very, very cheaply, scoop it up, and then that becomes their hub or their central place of business for distributing whatever substances that they're trafficking in. And so broken windows theory doesn't necessarily involve law enforcement except to highlight and identify those specific problem areas so that the city or the county can move in to help clean those up. If you take away the cheaper access or the easier access, you're deterring crime because you're making it more difficult for them to commit their acts, to sell their drugs, commit robberies, etc. It also makes it harder for gangs to firmly establish their presence in an area that's consistently monitored, cleaned up, and well maintained. Aggressive targeting, though, through the broken windows theory, allows neighborhoods to change their status. This is where the police get involved. So if the police will increase their presence with a focus on seeing things cleaned up, it gives property owners in the neighborhood an opportunity to come together and in a collective manner reinvest back into those areas to make better efforts. Rapid response is a theory that focuses on the fact that the quicker police can respond to a crime, the quicker they can deter crime by making arrests on a faster basis, and or simply deterring crime if criminals are made aware of the fact that a buddy of theirs committed a burglary into a business, but within 60 seconds police were on the scene and had him into custody. They may think twice about committing the same action. This one kind of falls somewhat in line with the aggressive patrol theory or the Kansas City study, in that you can move large numbers of officers into dedicated specific areas, but you can't keep them there all the time, because just because you've prevented crime in one neighborhood, there's a pretty good likelihood that all you've done is move the criminals into another neighborhood. One of the most efficient methods that has come to light so far is simply leveraging technology so that we're putting the right cops in the right area at the right time. This came to light with NYPD's CompStat, in which the 5 boroughs of New York each have several different policing precincts. And once a week, one of those precincts is brought into the NYPD's headquarters, or the captain of that precinct is brought in and made to stand before the chiefs, and they talk about their previous month's criminal statistics. And then they also talk about what plans they've developed to mitigate any new trends, meaning if burglaries have gone up in a certain precinct, that captain is expected to have a plan of how he's going to address that. If that plan doesn't meet the standard, that group of chiefs or that group of leaders within the room help them rebuild a new strategy, and then they'll bring in resources temporarily from the outside in order to mitigate that specific problem. This has evolved over time into the establishment of what's known as real-time crime centers, in which at a central location, leveraging the use of cameras, immediate access to 911 call records, etc., that the real-time crime center can begin to look at where they have a specific problem area, and then commanders can look at where they need to put officers and when they need to put officers in order to control and or deter. This is something that's been in existence for about 10 years, and most of the major cities have gotten a real good hang or a real good knack at leveraging the system appropriately, and they're starting to see its effects. But law enforcement, like any kind of other government function, is sometimes very slow to react because it doesn't always understand what's expected of them. This one is one that's really kind of starting to take off. It does require the use of the appropriate technologies, and one such example is a system known as ShotSpotter, and major cities have been spending millions of dollars investing into this. These are listening devices that are placed in strategic areas throughout their communities where they know they have high crime areas, and it simply listens. And so when it hears things like a gunshot, hence its name, it will triangulate the sound and come up with an approximate location that allows officers to instantly respond to a call, sometimes before a 911 call is even made. And the quicker they can get there, the quicker they can preserve a crime scene and hopefully detain and eventually arrest a suspect. Adding ShotSpotter to real-time crime centers in cities like New York has made a considerable difference in their solvability rates. So what are some problems in the investigative realm? Well, unsolved cases is always a big headache for most agencies. When felony level cases are not effectively managed or not effectively solved and closed with an arrest, it does nothing to deter crime. In fact, it only emboldens crime. Another hang up is that investigations take time. To be worked appropriately, every stone has to be turned over, sometimes twice, to find the right critical information necessary in order to move forward towards identifying and later apprehending a suspect. The longer that case takes, the more difficult that is, because we're relying on people's memory, people's willingness to cooperate, and sometimes biological information that can be removed in a short period of time. Sources of information is a big key for investigators. They leverage confidential informants on a regular basis. Sometimes that's the primary source of information related, especially in narcotics cases. However, informants can be unreliable, and when police act on information that they believe to be true that later turns out to be false, it only hinders the case and puts them in a point of starting back over. Bad cases start with bad information, and bad cases embolden criminal activity. That's always been a key in investigations, and it's a matter of training and moving in the right direction and in a standardized direction every single time. Some specialized roles or some newer roles and models that have come out is what we're going to talk about next. And the first one is community policing. Community policing requires an agency, first and foremost, to be able to articulate what a community is as a concept versus a geographical boundary. So you'll hear statements that says like, we are such and such city. We are Heston, or we are Hill City, or we are Wichita. And when they're saying things like that, they're talking about the people and not the place. And what that helps to do is not necessarily humanize those officers, but humanize the role that those officers have. And it helps to define the roles that community police officers have. In most big cities, it's a specific unit and it's a specific function because it's completely different than patrol or investigations. So those officers that are assigned to a community policing unit have to clearly understand what they're supposed to be doing in terms of building strategic partnerships and relationships within members of the neighborhood that they're assigned to. Some of the hangups with community policing has been changing the attitudes of leadership at both the executive and even the frontline supervisory level to get them to embrace this concept or change. Quite frankly, frontline supervisors that I have known in larger agencies resisted very aggressively the input of community policing because they only felt as though this was about giving out hugs and shaking hands and not doing real police work that cops were trained to do in the first place. Moving that mindset has proven a pretty serious challenge in many communities and has caused community policing efforts to fail in some cases and sent people back to the drawing board. Requires changing how we train officers. Officers that are going to be trained in community policing aspects have to be trained differently than officers that are going to, say, for instance, be on a SWAT team. It's a completely different mindset and thought process as they're working through it. It also requires larger agencies to change how they recruit new officers. If community policing is designed to ensure the public that they see the community as people, and the desire is to have the agency reflect the people that they serve, you have to be deliberate about who you're recruiting and where it is that they come from. It also requires outreach. Community policing officers cannot be introverted people. They have to be willing to put themselves out there. They have to be willing to accept the risk of being rejected by members of the community at the same rate that members of the community will accept them. Think of first impressions as our best example with that, and think of how many times you've had a first impression of someone that's like, that guy's a jerk. I don't want anything to do with him, or he's pompous, or he's proud of himself. And it may simply be because they're in a professional uniform with a dominating appearance. Once you finally get to know them or engage in a conversation with them, you may realize that your first impression of them was wrong, but that doesn't happen if officers aren't willing to step out into the community and get uncomfortable a little bit. Problem-oriented policing is purely strategically driven. It's a byproduct of community policing in which we've gained the community's trust, gain a better idea of where, and more specifically, who our problems are involved with, and then it involves a strategy of targeting those specific problems. Auto theft is an example that our textbook uses. So this involves identifying suspects, identifying predominant areas within a community where vehicle theft rates might be higher than in others. And then we start looking at different tactics such as bait cars or other sting operations related to removing those stolen vehicles. Violence with problem-oriented policing is a trickier subject. This involves more aggressive techniques such as stop and frisk, which has been controversial and caused an uproar in New York and LA and in other larger cities. But the dedicated purpose of the strategy was to prevent violence before it ever occurred. That means using tools such as stop and frisk or stop and ask, depending on how you labeled it, in order to determine who may or may not be a problem. High risk operations is a bullet point that I put in here because when officers misstep, misread or overreach, they open themselves, their department, and their jurisdiction up to some pretty heavy lawsuits sometimes. Intelligence led policing has been around since about 2008, and it involves agency leaders making data led decisions. And it is heavily reliant upon data from informants, from information that offenders give up in an interview, from crime data that comes in at a quicker rate than what we can see at the national level, from active surveillance, from community sources, and officers themselves. When we attempted to utilize it here in our tiny jurisdiction, one of the things that we came up with was field contact cards, so that if a member of the public, brought some information to our attention, we had the ability to write that information down and then collate that data. In other words, what a person may have told me about a specific instance may be different than what some other officer was told, and we can collate that data and begin to draw a conclusion. Evidence-based policing is the newest of these new policies, and it requires several inputs to make solid decisions. This is a scientific study that's usually done by PhDs or PhD candidates, and it requires the observation of data. It requires learning the experience of officers, leaning on the experiences of victims, and understanding the experiences of the community in order to understand really what strategies work and what don't. And then, even when employing new strategies, measuring their effectiveness before too much money is spent on a failure. No agency survives without support. They've got to have logistical support in everything that they do. And most police support functions involve internal affairs units whose job is to make sure that officers are doing things correctly in the right way, to investigate complaints against officers, and then recommend action if some is necessary or has been bad enough. The administrative function is clearly just the logistical and financial affairs of an agency. It costs money to operate a police department. It takes resources to operate a police department. Someone has to bid for and acquire those items. Communications, we think of dispatch centers, and in big cities, most agencies have their own, and in some places that they're shared, but their job is to receive and disseminate calls from the public to the appropriate people for the best response. And then most training units within most agencies are designed to receive the new strategies from leadership, and then put those strategies in place, and then begin training the officers in how to leverage those. The final section within the chapter talks about cost savings in policing, and that's a touchy subject because costs never don't go down; they always go up. And that becomes a frustration for the public, because as cost for an agency goes up, so too does the public's taxes that they have to pay. There have been measures over time that consider things like consolidation, i.e., in small communities, consolidating a sheriff's office and a police department together for shared functions. There's also been consolidation that occurs with multidisciplinary roles. And the best example here in Kansas is at Augusta, where they have a Department of Public Safety, and in which their line officers and staff are police officers. They're also trained firefighters, and they're also trained as EMTs. So instead of three separate agencies, they have one, and those crews perform those different functions at those different times. At the combined level of local, state, and federal, we sometimes see task force operations where people pool their resources. And for the locals, that means people. For the state and the federal government, that usually means money, and they all begin to work on specific targeted problems, such as a DEA task force or a FBI JTTF task force. The advantage to the federal government is they get access to officers who know the community that they serve. The advantage to the local law enforcement agency is they get access to resources that they can't afford or ordinarily wouldn't be able to connect to. Folks, that's the down and dirty on Chapter 6. I look forward to your discussion posts. Make sure, as always, that you're taking care of attendance like you're supposed to, and we'll talk next week.